known John for almost now 99 onwards when I got first introduced to him. Although he had already been on the editorial board of the journey, otherwise I met him much before, and they had known each other much before. So I came to know him through Professor Agarwal when I met with Columbia in New York, and I met him. This was get together with the hosting. He invited me. And then we had been correspondence since then. Almost every year. He has been very kind to review for me as well. He's mentioned a few seconds before. He has been, and I'm sure, he has, to his credit, a large number of profiles. I will request Yamini to just briefly rush through. I will just give you 2-3 things which I have known personally. He has been also the motivator for derivative report which came out from the Research Institute of America in New York, where he was the director, and also the editor for the journal. He is also currently the contributing editor for the MSc Journal of Animal Laws, which I learned. I got a glimpse of it when I visited his home almost 15 years back, but then I did not know it was more passion. And I understand that comes from the fact that his father was also heading the editorial laboratory back in his time, in the 50s, 30s, 40s, and that's where that love for animals came into play. So we will do again 2 talks today, one on the money laundering, which you've heard and seen it grow and things move on in the United States, and of course the second one on the fraud investigation, which is going to speak about. So apart from that, he has been the editor-in-chief for almost a decade at the Journal of Taxation Regulatory Framework. He's a very prominent journal. He's been an author himself. He's also been a chair of the Bank and Savings Security Committee of the American Bar Association, and as he said, he's a practicing lawyer. And I'll leave it to Yamini and Joanne who joined us as well tonight, who is also have been on this session herself, with an MBA graduate degree a long back, and she was a career. And request Yamini to brief for a minute or two. I also wanted to introduce you. He has been very kind. As he said, he reviewed work for me, he gave me advice. He also connected me to a head of this called Hira Cover, which we were discussing a few minutes back, who is now on the research council of the institute as well. Hira as well has been a member of the Chicago Mercantile Exchange, also has been at the board of the Federal Reserve Board, and has senior positions. He is an active member of the Derivative Society of the United States, has been a lawyer, and very active. He has his own consulting firm and has been doing very well, I understand. Later this week, we are going to have dinner with him. I request not to please continue my class as well. Yeah. I will request Yamini to briefly introduce, and then you move on to speak.
Good afternoon. I would like first of all welcome Professor John and his wife to India and this institute as one of the learned and most honorable people who are serving as one of the editorial board members at International Bank. Professor John, as Aman said, is an American attorney, national consultant and author. He is also the contributing editor to the MSc Journal of Animal Law, USA. It is quite humbling to actually read through his profile, where he has actually served as an American attorney and a national consultant. He has authored several books like The Service and the Therapy Laws of the American Society, Science, Law and the Evolution of Canine Evidence, and the Police and Military Laws, Criminal Detection, Forensic Evidence, and the Judicial Admissibility. He is the editor of the Complete Book of Laws, editor of the Money Laundering, Terrorism, and Financial Institutions, a treatise which he updates monthly with a newsletter as an information service to the attorneys, covering laws, regulations, and compliance issues surrounding the USA Data Act, a contributor to the GP Soul magazine and the Tax Codes, as well as a contributing editor for the canine legal issues, which may be found on the website of the Animal Legal and Historical Center of the Michigan State University. Well, Professor John has graduated from the University of California, Berkeley, whereas as an honor student he engaged in research, voyaged for the Stanford Research Vessel T. Vega studying parasitic infestations of the Pacific Pheasants. He earned his JD and LLM degrees from the Hastings College of Law and the New York University School of Law, respectively. Practices law in New York and is a member of the Bar of the United States Supreme Court. Well, to look at his early years, he did not initially start with the financial ring. various authorities wanted to institutionalize as being dangerous to themselves or to others. He has also worked as a class action right to treatment cases against the New Jersey public mental health hospitals. Well, if you look at his later years, he then served under part of the taxation, where in the early 1980s, after years of advocating for patient rights and many pro-OMRs, he turned his attention to financial institutions by joining Silverman and Brandon as a tax associate. He then became executive editor of Tax Journals and on to the managing editor of the Tax Books, which led to his joining of Warren, Gordon and Lamont as senior managing editor of the Tax Protocols and Services. After that, he became the director of the RIA, Research Institute of America, which is now the RIA Checkpoint Accounting Institute, Tax Periodicals and the International Tax Product from 1996 to 2000. He was also an adjunct professor and taught financial products and institutions, money laundering and tax crimes from 2004 to 2007 at the Peter J. Topping College of Business, which has led him to be becoming the chair of the Banking and Savings Institutions Committee of the American Bar Association Tax Section and the editor-in-chief of the same. In 2000 and 2009, Journal of Taxation and Regulation of Financial Institutions, he was editor as well. During this time, he also founded Delta Hedge Consulting, to which he has also served as the past president. He wrote about the chapter 7, Derivatives in the Tax-Conscious Charitable World for Frank J. Corbusi's book, The Use of Derivatives in Tax Planning. One of his early tax articles about hedges is cited by W. Bosler, an arm's length solution to the shareholders' known tax person in the Seton Hall Law Review. Another often cited article of his is in the Virginia Tax Review. The Universal Venture Act brought him the practice into a sphere of terrorism and financial institution, and was also one of the reasons why he is known as one of the big authorities in money laundering, terrorism, and financial institutions. He's contributed to several journals with respect to derivatives, two of which are Journal of Corporate Taxation and Tax Rules. Besides his interest in taxation and as serving as an attorney general, he also pursues his love for animals, especially dogs, and he has been working quite very much on several articles that he writes for dogs, as well as how these species can be helpful in providing the necessary support to the people who are disabled or disadvantaged in this society. His works again has been edited largely in the world wide. And now I can welcome Professor John to speak.
John to come up to the second presentation, which is again, I believe, one of the second labs after his wife, the third lab after the learning of law, which is law sophistication and social, economic impact of human family relationship. I will speak on this now.
I'm one of those people who's had many careers, so many careers that it's hard to say in the end what I really am. The subject of dogs does not seem like it has much of an economic component, but I'll give it one. Robert Vogel. Has anybody ever heard of Robert Vogel? Won the Nobel Prize in Economics in 1993 for various studies on the history of economics. One of the first surprising conclusions when I started to read Robert Vogel's book about the human body, remember, this is an economist, not a biologist, not an historian, was that he looked at the average size of the soldier conscripted into Napoleon's army at the end of the 18th, beginning of the 19th century. The average that might be? Give me a guess. Any guess? No guess is wrong. Well, some guess. Most guesses will be wrong. But what would you guess? The pounds, preferably. I weigh over 200 pounds. You think that Napoleon's soldiers weighed 200 pounds? You think they weighed 150 pounds? Remember, it's 200 years ago. No, didn't weigh 200. What do you think they weighed? Give me a number. 250 pounds? They weighed more than me?
Yes, they were soldiers.
They were soldiers, yes. The average soldier in Napoleon's army had the height and weight of my wife, who weighs 1/2 of what I do, more or less. The average soldier in Napoleon's army weighed just over 100 pounds and stood between 5'2" and 5'4". This is known by the research of an economist, not an historian. What he did is he found all the conscription records. Not only did he find out of Napoleon's army, but of the British Navy at the same time, as well as the British Army at the same time. He found another thing that was very interesting. The British Army was much bigger than the British Navy. Why? Why would people in the Navy weigh less than people and be shorter than people in the Army? Think about it economically. Because people who came into the Navy were conscripted from the poorer classes, often involuntarily, from groups of people who didn't have much food. They were forced, they were gang pressed into naval service. It was the primary way of getting people to work on ships from the 18th century, really. There would be a gang press that would go out and surround the village and take away all the young men. They were often poor. They were not well defended. The Army, on the other hand, this is the Army that eventually defeated Napoleon, was taken from the upper classes. They ate much more. They were always thin. They were taller. They weighed more. This is all described by an economist, for which he won the Nobel Prize. And I think that when one starts to look at history and human evolution, one can find economic components in a great deal of things. If you're out, your sole source of food is, and I'm talking about Pleistocene times, before the development of agriculture, the people who lived on the Russian plains in Europe, here, China. How did they survive? They survived on meat. They brought down game animals. They chased game animals. They chased game animals that were much faster than them. They had to outsmart them. They had to work in groups. They had to have some people at one point and then try and steer the game to go to another point, to that point, but have people, say, eating bushes or something. So at that point, the game would be brought down. Somewhere between 15 and 35,000 years ago, some of these tribes, these primitive Stone Age tribes, realized that it was sometimes too hard to get but there are animals that hang around the camps. Animals that have started to sort of eat the refuse of the camp, started to form some social interaction with the members of the camp. And those animals have 4 legs and can run as fast or faster than the game and can get around to the other side. Those animals were dogs. The evolution of dogs is a very contentious subject. It used to be an archaeological subject, primarily. You dig up bones. It doesn't look quite like a wolf. It's a little smaller than a wolf. Its head is a little more compressed. It has, I'm not sure how much my slides are going to go, so I'm not going to end on this too much. How do I move to the next? So it's all right. Oh, this isn't going to work. Maybe some of them will. I'll just hold it up for a second. Maybe you can see a little bit of a, there's a image here. I have a better idea. I have a print. It's not, it's a little better. This is a wall painting from France. It's in color. Unfortunately, my copy machine doesn't make color copies. So. From about 11 or 12,000 years ago, this appeared on the wall of a cave in France. It was discovered by French and English scientists, archaeologists, working in the caves of France about 100 years ago, a little more than 100 years ago. And they said that was a wolf. They said that the cavemen, first of all, they believed at the time that dogs were not domesticated until ancient Egypt. So anything that was older than ancient Egypt, anything that was older than 5,000 years ago, BC, had to be a wolf. But there are reasons to think it's a dog. First of all, we now know that from genetic evidence that dogs were domesticated at least 15,000 years ago and quite possibly 30,000 years ago. There's other reasons though. A wolf, I don't want to get too much into the botany of a wolf, but a wolf has a fairly straight line from forehead to the tip of its nose. This animal has what is called a stop. Dogs have stops, wolves do not. Also, wolves have very long, narrow hips. The brain casing is sort of is more back and forward, less up above the eyelids. This has a larger brain casing. I believe it's a dog. I'm not qualified to make that judgment, but I have been in contact with a woman named Mietje German-Bray. She's a Belgian archaeologist who has dug up the oldest dog fossil ever found 36,000 years ago from the Goya Cave in Belgium. And she thinks as well, as she's told me off the record, she knows it's a dog. She does not publish yet. There are people that believe that Neanderthals, type of human, died out because they did not make friends with dogs, but we did. It's possible. We don't know. We can't be and exist on every continent. They exist on most inhabited islands. But they are so common that we often ignore them. We ignore them in art. I mean, who wants to see a dog? You see a dog all the time, you walk out of the house, you see it. If I looked at pictures in the travel books about India before I came here, and somebody said to me, what are you going to see based on what you see in the travel books when you come to India? I would say, well, I'm probably going to see a lot of tigers. They seem to be all over the place. Every book has pictures of tigers. I'm probably going to see some leopards. Might see a few dozen elephants. I have seen some elephants, but I have not seen tigers. But if they said, based on the books I've read, they asked, are you going to see any dogs? I'd say, no. I don't think there are any dogs in India. They're certainly not in the travel books. I've seen more dogs than anything else. And this is not a unique culture. I think if you went to almost any country in the world, we accept dogs as being so much with us that we no longer think about them. We no longer think that maybe their ability to help us hunt is why we were able to have the time to develop a mega. There are some very interesting genetic studies going on right now about dogs and genetics and parallel genetics with humans. It turns out that when our diets changed from primarily meat diets that our ancestors had, and we started to eat grains and other fruits and other vegetables and fruits, the digestive aspects of our bodies had to evolve. And we started to duplicate genes that produced proteins that helped that digestion. Oddly enough, dogs did the same thing at the same time. They started to duplicate genes that helped them digest grains, vegetables. The wolf in the wild will not, if it can help it, eat anything that is vegetable. It does not have the mechanism to digest it. Dogs have replicated the same gene we do. Dogs share some of our diseases, but wolves do not share. They have been with us so long that we don't realize how similar to us they have become. When dogs first associated with people, it may very well have been their choice, not ours. They may have seen us as throwing away bones that we couldn't eat, but they could chew on. They could get some sustenance out of the bone that we couldn't eat. They may have started eating things that we regarded as junk. They may have known they can. Somehow that primitive population of wolves that was living several hills away divided into wolves that stayed away from us and wolves that started getting closer. That animal that I showed you looks enough like a wolf that it is hard to say whether it is a wolf. I think that the brain casing for me makes it a dog, but I'm not qualified to make that decision. Dogs have traveled with us. Again, it's easier to use this. This is a picture of something called a dingo. It is an animal that lives in Australia only. Has anybody ever heard of the dingo? When European explorers first arrived in Australia, it was discovered that the Aborigines had dingoes. They thought they were tame wolves. They thought the Aborigine population had tame wolves that were indigenous. Only about 10 years ago did the genetics of this animal become clear, and it became clear that it was not a wolf, it was a dog. The Aborigines arrived 40,000 years ago in Australia. Genetic analysis has established that the dingoes arrived about 5,000 years ago. There is no other indigenous population of Australia at this point than the Aborigines. So, what did they do? Swim there? The theory is that they came on canoes. This is a New Zealand war canoe. It is not an ancient canoe, but it probably doesn't look that different. And it's too detailed right here, but if you look closely at one of the women on the deck of the boat, you will see that she has in her lap a dog. So if the dogs were brought 5,000 years ago, who brought them? The Aborigines were already there, so they didn't bring them. The theory at the moment is a group of peoples called the Austronesian peoples who were expanding out of Southeast Asia, brought dogs with them, but why? Just have pets so they could play with them. A war canoe was a very highly refined item. You didn't bring unnecessary baggage. A pet that you can play with is unnecessary baggage. So why did they bring it? Any ideas? Probably to eat. They probably brought them primarily as food. But they probably also, in other words, not too dissimilar to, say, bringing pigs, but dogs have one big advantage. If you camp down at night, dogs notify you when strangers come. Dogs notify you when threats are there. So they probably had two functions. One was to eat, and the other was to guard the camp. And they will guard the camp, even if they are labor eaten. They have been remarkably faithful to us, more so than we are to them. This is an actual map of how some scientists think dogs were brought into the South Pacific, that the canoe peoples started perhaps in Taiwan, perhaps in somewhere in Southeast Asia, and started spreading out about 5,000 years ago into the Pacific Islands. They populated New Guinea and left the dog there. It's called the New Guinea singing dog. It was only discovered about 30 years ago. It was living high up in the mountains and nobody knew about it. So dogs travel. One slide that would be nice to show, but isn't going to show too well. In the First World War, Royal Air Force pilots flying over Jordan, Syria, Israel, Lebanon, would see these structures that they said look like kites, the kind of kites that children fly in the air, sort of triangular or four-sided objects that were a little longer on one end. And they called them desert kites, and they told British archaeologists about these kites. Archaeologists then excavated them and found that what they were was ways of driving antelope into a narrow, which used to be sort of prevalent in the Fertile Crescent Middle East, Near Eastern area. They would drive antelope down into a narrow path, either into a kind of deeper painful facility, too deep, and then they would start picking them off with arrows. But how did they get them to run into those? It appears that as early as maybe 7,000 BC, they were using dogs for this purpose. So the original hunting might not have looked too much like what you think of hunting, somebody going on in the forest and with my dog and I've got it done, and I see some birds over there, and so I send the dog around, and the dog watches the birds and shoot them. That's, I think, probably not how it happened. Arrows don't work at too much distance. There's probably some more devices like this that were the first hunting facilities. Whatever it was, by the time of ancient Egypt, we know that there were more than one type of dog used in hunting. This looks like an ancient dog walker. It's got two sets of dogs. These ones are heavier. There's a little one up there. These ones are much longer and sleeker. This one seems to be a third type because it doesn't have the same ears as this or this. So it's probably really a terrier type of dog. What's the difference? Well, when you're chasing something like a deer or a rabbit, a very, very fast animal, first of all, you have to find them. So you need dogs that use their noses to get them down to the ground and follow the track. And that might take half a day. That dog is working all the time. So then you see that you've got close to the animal you want to catch. But that dog's exhausted. That dog has been doing his job and he's not very fast. Anyway. So you want a greyhound, nap hand. You want what's called cycling. You want a dog that no longer uses his nose but focuses in with his eyes and is fast. And aside from the cheetah, some greyhounds are the fastest animals alive. They can bring down a deer, but only in a short distance. You have to get them close enough that they can run and catch the animal. So I'm making a case here that there is an economics in history of dogs and continues to be. They were used to guard. This one really can't see, but it shows, this is from a Babylonian cylinder seal. It shows a shepherd stabbing a lion from behind while I'm going to send, well, you have these slides, I think it's distributed, and it shows the dog attacking from one side the lion so that the shepherd can keep his flock safe, the dog and he have to combine to attack the lion. The lion is a very dangerous animal. Dogs began to be used in war. I'll say a little bit more about that later. I'm trying to make my time commitment here. It became part of our mythology. This is a Christian sarcophagus from 3rd century AD, from about 1700. It shows Abraham about to sacrifice his son Isaac. We know, the artists know, the angel will stop him before he actually kills his son. But the artist, wanting to fill out the picture, decides that Abraham must have had a dog in the book. Maybe a dog that was a friend of Isaac's, getting upset that his companion is going. Dogs become part of mythology. Later cultures interject them back into stories where they didn't actually exist for a while. Dogs did become pets by Egypt. We have pictures of pharaohs sitting on chairs with dogs curled up, small dogs, useless dogs, wouldn't do anything, sitting under their chairs. And we know from the Roman Empire, dogs became pets. How many people here own a dog? Should have asked that question. 1, 2, 3, 4. This is the anti-dog group over here. How many people have family members own dogs? So that's more than half the room. Okay. I find one of the most interesting aspects of dog history took place in the medieval English wars. And the medieval wars in northern Europe. The late Middle Ages, the Dark Ages and the late Middle Ages was a period of economic stagnation. World commerce largely did not exist. Areas that lived on it. If you were the Maharaja, if you were the king, if you were a high lord, what did you do to entertain yourself? You hunted. I've taken a lot of pictures. My wife can testify how obsessive I get about this. I've taken a lot of pictures of Maharajas chasing deer, rabbits, other animals with dolphins. It was a common part of the culture. I found one picture from Khajuraho of about 1100 AD. Shows a very clear swine. Dog chasing swine. Maharaja on his horse about to spear the swine. This has been part of culture. I don't know when it began here. It certainly would have existed here by the time Alexander the Great wrote, because he was a major, but it probably existed before that. In Europe, in a period of economic decline, the only thing that kings could do to entertain themselves was go out and capture deer. But it was a big problem if the commoners were also capturing, because when the king didn't have a good time, he wants to go out and see lots of deer. He doesn't want to go out and hear that, well, there might be one over there 5 miles, and we're going to ride 5 miles. So he sets up rules about who can hunt and where. And he says, in a royal forest, if you're not the king or somebody chosen by the king, you can. Well, what if you're a peasant living on the edge and you need a dog to sort of protect your house, maybe for comfort, maybe for keeping rodents out of the house? That's okay, but if your dog can chase deer, that's not okay. So how do they determine? The kings create a sort of group. This is a drawing of one. They create a sort of group, and they say, this is the kingdom. If your dog, and this group would be about this high, if your dog can walk through them, you can keep your dog. If it can't, 2 choices. One is you kill your dog. Another is we take the hind leg of the dog and chop it off about here. It's no longer going to be able to chase. The third most common was that they would cut the sinews at the back of the leg so the dog would be permanently lame. Too slow to change the deer. And this went on for at least 700 years. Large parts of England were forests reserved. This is the New Forest just across from the Isle of Wight, totally reserved for the king. This went on through Queen Elizabeth. This is a picture, a woodcut drawing showing Queen Elizabeth receiving an honorary knife from one of the huntsmen who is about to open up the deer. It's all ritualistic, but it's all based around loyalty, and if you aren't of that level, you don't hunt in those areas. Here's where Robert Fogel comes back in. I started to see a lot of paintings of medieval kings, and my first reaction on seeing this was, why did they have such big dogs? Why were the dogs so big? If this dog is beside me and my waist is there, that dog's head is here. Now, there are a few dogs that are that big. But that, after I read Robert Fogel, I realized it's not what's happening. It's not that the dog is big, it's that Charles V was short. The dog is probably no higher than about here, typical hunting dog. And a lot of perspective changed for me when I began to realize that in certain parts of human culture, and we want some, is everybody still awake? In certain places of human culture, dogs probably were the difference between habitation barrier and the inability to hunt. This is an artist's depiction from the description of Marco Polo in the 13th century of a dog sled in Siberia. In Siberia and Alaska on the other side, and all the way across to Greenland. Those areas were only inhabitable because dogs were trained to pull sleds into the woods. Horses can't operate that far north in most times of the year. They will get bogged down and die. In order to live year-round in a large part of the world until the 20th century when the mechanism changed, these places would not have been inhabitable were it not for dogs. War dogs. When the Spanish discovered the New World, they already had experience fighting in wars with war dogs. And they realized one thing: war dogs had not been common in history. If you and your army are dressed the same, more or less the same, if your skin color is more or less the same, if your diets are more or less the same, and you send attack dogs who are trained to attack people and say, kill. All right. If the army stayed apart, that might work, but armies tend to collapse upon each other. And if there's armies worldwide, those dogs are going to start attacking everybody. They're made to, that's why Caesar wouldn't use elephants. His concern was, fine as long as the armies are separated, but if they start getting in the middle of a battle, those elephants can stampede off and kill my soldiers as easily as theirs. But the Spaniards realized that when they were facing the Indians dressed differently, they smelled differently, they used different weapons, they organized themselves differently. The dogs could be taught to distinguish the enemy. And even by Columbus' second, this is not something that certain people once said about Columbus, even by the second time he would arrive in Hispaniola, which is modern Haiti, in the Dominican Republic, even by that time, he was using war dogs against the Indians. And there are plenty of depictions of his drawings that were made by contemporaries. When Gonzalo Perez entered Peru, the major part of his force, and he went down the coast, the major part of his force was 1,000 dogs. That means 1,000 dogs, a lot of food for dogs, an individual handler for each dog. He was expecting to decimate the Indian except it didn't work. The Indians had by now realized that they didn't have a way of fighting dogs, so they just disappeared into the hills. Pizarro marched over 1,000 miles, found no Indians to fight, depended on finding them for food source, because he would take whatever food sources the Indians had. So he wasn't finding any Indians, he was running out of food. What did he do? They ate the dogs. They brought 1,000 dogs into Peru and returned with 2 alive. The rest of them. There is a weaving that was made by the Aztecs after the conquest of Cortez in Mexico. And one of the things on the weaving is the weaving does not survive, but paintings made by Catholic priests do survive and show how bloodthirsty the Aztecs perceived the dogs as being. The American history of slavery, unfortunately, has a great deal of dogs. Slaves would run away at night. Slaves didn't see much in the dark, and the people pursuing them didn't see much in the dark. But a dog can follow a trail, light or dark. Dogs began to be used to capture escaped slaves. Curiously, after the end of the Civil War, those dogs were then retrained to catch criminals. In the beginning of the American Society of Criminal Tracking Dogs, the beast of In World War I, over 10,000 dogs served in the medical corps, particularly of Germany, England, and France. Dogs that would be trained to find wounded soldiers on the battlefield, maybe lead them back, maybe just stay there and bark until the stretcher bearers could arrive. The German dogs were trained to if the soldier could move at all, even if he was blinded, the dog was trained to sort of accept his weight. After World War I, German dog trainers said, we have a lot of wounded soldiers who have no way of seeing. These dogs don't need to be used in battle anymore. We're going to train them to guide in society. That's the beginning of the guide dog movement after World War I. Dogs were also used in World War I to deliver messages. This is not a battle scene. It's not a battle scene. The Germans and the English developed messenger dogs, dogs that will go from the front line to the back line with a message. These dogs are being trained to run through gunfire. They would sometimes get killed, one of them did get killed, but less killed than the soldiers who were previously carrying those kinds of things. Because first of all, they're on 4 legs, they're moving low. You might have 1 or 2 chances to shoot at the animal. With a soldier running, you could, have a dozen chances before you killed them. So there were thousands used in World War I. By World War II, we had walkie-talkies and so forth, and that was no longer necessary. Nowadays, dogs are used in all kinds of ways. Dogs detect cancer. There are dogs being trained, and I work with somebody who does this now in Poland, who has trained dogs to detect cancer, certain kinds of cancer, before any medical equipment. Remember that the dog's nose can smell maybe 1/billionth of the amount you taste. A cancer cell in your skin may only multiply 2 or 3 times as dog can tell machines. So there's starting to be, just now, the beginning of uses of dogs in plentiful environments. My message here is that dogs adapt as we change. They always find a way to be useful, and they continue to do so throughout history, and will continue to do so into the future. Thank you.
Thanks, John. I'd like to open the discussion on questions here, both on the money laundering and on the issue of dogs and even the situation. I would request bring some more questions together from the people from outside. Questions? No money laundering, I will just talk.
My name is Rahul Yadav, and I'm a second-year student here. My question is related to dog investigation. What is the difference between coyote and a dog?
A coyote is a wild animal found primarily in the United States, though very related to a kind of wolf found in Ethiopia. Nobody knows what the connection exists. Coyotes separated from wolves. Some people estimate about 400,000 years ago. Some people estimate 800,000 years ago. They're smaller. They're quicker. They can be more inconspicuous. They tend to live in semi-urban environments. We live in the winter in Arizona, in the United States. And I would say an average of 2 or 3 times a night, we wake up with they have a yipping sound. They try to drive rabbits and so forth out of shrubbery and eat them. They're very wily, very clever animals. They are not protected by the United States federal government because there are a lot of them. Wolves, it should be, I didn't say this, but it used to be debated whether dogs came maybe from coyotes, wolves, jackals. In fact, Darwin, the great developer of evolution, thought dogs all came from several strands of canines, but biological analysis and genetic analysis established that dogs are only from wolves, from the great wolf.
One question is about money laundering as this talk about.
Yeah.
What are the international efforts which have been laid down? Because we see what has happened in Bali, or like you talked about 9/11, or it has been in Mumbai attacks. We have seen they are on the rise. It does not seem that much effort has been done at international level. So what are your suggestions at international level which should be done so that we can just drop it?
Well, I'm not too much an expert on that international level question. There is an organization called the Financial Action Task Force, which maintains offices inside of the OECD in Paris. The Financial Action Task Force is sort of a think tank for the financial intelligence units of the world. And I don't know specifically, but I imagine your financial intelligence unit is probably a member of the Financial Action Task Force. The United States Financial Crimes Enforcement Network is also a member of the Financial Action Task Force. The FATF, which is what's usually called, provides analysis of every country that is a member. In fact, they do it periodically. I don't know how many analysis India's had, the United States had 2 or 3. And every few years they update an analysis and they say to the country, you're good in this, but you're missing that, then if the country is really not developing very well, they apply some pressure. Now, if you mean cross-border cooperation, that's highly erratic because the way governments are, sometimes they will help a neighbor find a terrorist, sometimes they don't really do the kind of assistance they should. But it is a problem. I mean, you hit the nail on the head. It's a major problem because some countries don't cooperate, sometimes they don't cooperate because they don't have a relationship with the other country, like it. They don't. They may support terrorism in the environment. So there is much more needed to be done. That's correct.
Your work is mostly correlated with terrorism only about the money laundering.
I'm not sure.
I said you have correlated your money laundering with the terrorism or they say drug mafia, etc. So what portion of money laundering goes into this and the remaining is lab, which is of course, people may have their personal thinking and shifting money from one place to another. So my question is, what percentage is related with this terrorism of money laundering?
A very small percentage is related to terrorism because, well, first of all, it's so much harder to catch, but it is so much easier to conduct that we're probably only finding the surface, and there's a constant effort to sort of find what sort of systems are being used by terrorists. It's clear that they adapt their technology, their approaches when they find that something they're doing is being uncovered. For instance, there were some years ago, there were a lot of reports about certain kinds of businesses like transfers in gold, say transfers of gold from one country to another, and say that the gold is worth $100,000 for the sake of argument, but the gold is actually sold into the other country at a price of $200,000. So the $100,000 that comes back is not to pay for the gold, but to be fed off into terrorist activities. Well, when this sort of thing started to appear to the Financial Crimes Enforcement Network, they sent out emails to customs officials saying, check the value of gold, and there were a few other techniques that were used in this category, like the price, and you effectively move money across the border. It looks like it's part of the purchase price, but it's actually an extraneous transaction, and people on both ends are really transferring money under the radar. There's often, I would say that there's probably almost every day there's a new technique uncovered. Now, not all of these are made public because sometimes they want to see how much they can uncover before they have to go public about it.
Is the activity of transfer pricing something, I mean, putting up a restriction on?
Yeah, it can involve transfer pricing activities, yes. That's
Is there any specific act to cover this money laundering through it? Is it really happening or it is just for the namesake?
I think that at times it's been fairly common, some of these things, because the actual just simple transfer of funds becomes too easily detected, so they will find some trade mechanism. It often happens in the informal hawala markets where money is there's a series of unspoken agreements, and it can be very hard, particularly for butting up, American officials to get down to that level and sort of figure it out. Happening all the time. Good observation.
Thank you.
I have another question. What
government has failed to address, really. When John Corzine, former governor of New Jersey, who got into trouble recently for the that aside, he was also the head of Goldman Sachs, and he was called before Congress in the time of 2002 or 2003, and they were asking him how he, as a finance person, would move money. He said, I wouldn't bother with any of this stuff you're talking about. I just do it all through hedge funds because you've got no visibility there. And there is that hedge funds that are a big industry. And they're going to have to clamp down on that. The problem is there's such a big part of the industry that wants to keep that anonymous. But it's a real good question, but I don't have an answer, and I don't think anybody does.
The last one.
Yeah, that's people.
So just I am trying to remind you to increasing level, and I just want to know if the RBI is doing the policies for like the immediate the main problem for India. Like you said, the FII investment are going to the stock market. So in the policies, we can say that how much we can put on effort so we can do shadowing coming future. Like we also have a parallel economy in India. Policies is only for that we can be able to see it right, like income tax for the economy.
Well, there are different kinds of reporting, such as income tax, which provide secondary information about activities, and sometimes income tax activities do actually lead to the discovery of money laundering, particularly in the drug industry, where quite often the drug lords are making so much money they didn't have to pay income taxes if that was their only problem. The trouble is it becomes an admission that they have been making huge amounts of money through illegal activity. They're committing a tax crime by not reporting it, but they're committing a much more serious crime if they do report it and use it to discover that. Yeah, it's an area where bringing together the different aspects is constantly any government, and I'm sure the Indian government as well, is constantly doing that. I think we're going to.
Yes. I now request the Vice President to come and present a copy of the latest of the Journal of Finance India. We will share on the paper as well. Will also finally present a copy of the latest publication of the book by Dr. Everyone to John. And I request consider reviewing the book, given his vast knowledge, both in legal and financial industry, not only from the financial industry perspective, he has scientific fields that he can be competent for instance. So I would request the army to mind present small note for him to remember us while he's back home and in his home foreign office to 3 months there on the board so that reminding him to come back to India as well. Joanna request you to present a small token as well to her pen, so she can be writing as well as John.